Don Quixote. In the quiet plains of central Spain, where the sun hangs low over fields of gold and the air smells faintly of dust and olive trees, there lived a man whose mind was filled with dreams. His name was Alonso Quijano, a gentleman of La Mancha. He wasn't rich, nor particularly remarkable. He lived simply, surrounded by old furniture, yellowing books, and a life that had grown too small for the size of his imagination. But in those books, in the tales of shining knights and enchanted maidens, of dragons, giants, and quests for honor, he found something that reality had forgotten, a world that still believed in goodness. Every night, as the wind rattled his shutters, Alonso read until dawn. He read about Amadis of Gaul, Palmerin of England, and every knight who ever fought for love and justice. And little by little, the boundary between those pages and his own mind began to blur, until one morning, somewhere between madness and revelation, he stood, trembling with purpose. "The world," he whispered, "has lost its heroes. So I shall become one." He fashioned a helmet from an old barber's basin. He pulled on rusted armor, dented and squeaking. His horse, a bony, tired creature, he renamed Rocinante, believing the name gave it grandeur. And because every knight needs a lady, he chose a woman who had never asked for such a title, Aldonza Lorenzo, a farm girl from a nearby village. To him, she became Dulcinea del Toboso, the most virtuous lady in the world. From that day, Alonso Quijano ceased to exist. The man who left his village was Don Quixote de la Mancha, knight-errant, protector of the helpless, and defender of the forgotten dream. He rode out beneath the blazing sun, lance upright, heart full of righteousness, and for a brief moment the dry Castilian plains became a kingdom once more. The hills were watchtowers, the windmills sentinels of evil, the cattle armies on the march. To anyone else, he looked absurd, a thin man in tattered armor, wobbling on a skeletal horse. But inside his mind, he was glorious. He was chosen. His first stop was a roadside inn, but to his enchanted eyes, it was no mere inn. It was a castle, its courtyard full of noble knights and maidens. He knelt before the astonished innkeeper and begged to be dubbed a knight. The innkeeper, amused and eager to play along, tapped his shoulders with his sword and declared him Sir Don Quixote de la Mancha. That night, the self-made knight stood guard over his armor in the courtyard, as real knights were said to do. When two travelers tried to move his things, he attacked them with ferocity, shouting of honor and treachery. The scuffle ended with bruises, laughter, and confusion. But Don Quixote felt victorious. He was a knight now. The world simply didn't know it yet. The next morning he set off again, eager to perform his first deed of valor. On the road he met merchants and demanded they confess that no woman in the world was more beautiful than his lady Dulcinea. When they laughed, he attacked, and was swiftly beaten and left in the dust. A neighbor found him and carried him home, broken but beaming. Even in defeat, he saw meaning. For in every knight's tale, suffering was proof of greatness. At home, his friends, the priest and the barber, grew alarmed. They searched his library, horrified by the endless shelves of chivalric romances, and decided to burn them all. As the smoke curled up into the morning air, Alonso's niece wept, hoping it might heal him. But fire cannot burn a dream, and madness, once born of faith, doesn't die easily. Within weeks, Don Quixote was ready to ride again. This time, he would not ride alone. He persuaded a simple farmer, Sancho Panza, to join him as his squire, promising riches and an island to govern some day. Sancho was everything Quixote was not: short, round, practical, and suspicious of fancy ideas. He knew his master was mad, but something in Don Quixote's conviction, that impossible hope in his eyes, made it impossible to say no. And so they set off together, a fool and a dreamer, trotting side by side into legend. Their first adventure together began in a wide open plain dotted with windmills. Don Quixote raised his lance. "Fortune," he cried, "guides our arms. There stand 30 or more monstrous giants whose arms whirl through the air." Sancho blinked. "Giants? Those are windmills, master." But Quixote would not listen. Cowardice, Sancho, has no place in chivalry. He charged. The wind caught the sails, and one great arm swung around and smashed him from his horse. He hit the ground with a clatter of metal and dust. Sancho ran to him. "Didn't I tell you, sir, they were windmills?" Quixote groaned. "The enchantments of evil wizards turned them to windmills to rob me of my victory." Even pain could not pierce his faith. From there the misadventures multiplied. He attacked a group of friars, thinking they were kidnappers. He freed a chain of prisoners, believing them oppressed souls, who then robbed him as soon as they were free. He fought a flock of sheep, mistaking them for enemy armies. Each disaster made him only more certain that sorcery was conspiring against him. Sancho, loyal and exasperated, followed him through every scrape. He was beaten, bruised, and sometimes humiliated, but he stayed, because in some secret place he had begun to believe too. Back home, the priest and barber plotted a rescue. They disguised themselves and tricked Don Quixote into a cage, convincing him it was a magical carriage that would take him to Dulcinea. Quixote accepted it cheerfully, convinced that great heroes often suffered imprisonment before their triumph. And thus the knight returned home, not defeated, but enchanted in his own story. The news of his adventures spread. People laughed, shared the stories, and began to adore him in a strange way. He became both mockery and legend, a man who reminded Spain of something it had forgotten. Cervantes, the man behind the tale, knew this irony well. He too had been a soldier, wounded in battle, imprisoned, forgotten by his country. Through Don Quixote, he poured all the pain and beauty of human idealism. Part 1 of the story ends here, a madman home again, yet still believing that the world can be saved by courage and love. He is bruised but not broken, and somewhere, deep in the Spanish plains, the windmills keep turning. Because heroes, real or imagined, never rest for long. 10 years passed in the world of La Mancha. The fields grew a little drier, the villages a little quieter, and the tales of the mad knight grew into legend. And then As if summoned by his own story, Don Quixote wrote again, older, thinner, but still burning with that impossible light in his eyes. Sancho Panza was waiting for him. He didn't need convincing this time. He knew that life beside Don Quixote, no matter how foolish, was larger than life without him. So the two mounted their horses once more, heading into the sunrise, a pair of souls chasing dreams that the world no longer believed in. But this time, something was different. The world knew his name. In the villages and towns they passed, people whispered and pointed. Children ran alongside them calling, "It's him!" The Knight of La Mancha, the fictional Don Quixote, had become real within his own story. It was a brilliant trick by Cervantes, a story that knew it was a story. And in that self-awareness, Don Quixote became something more than a character. He became a mirror for us. The pair wandered the roads, arguing and laughing as they always had, but their journeys grew stranger and more poignant. Don Quixote was no longer just mad, he was wise in his madness, and his sanity came and went like clouds over the sun. Sancho, too, was changing. He still chased food and comfort, but somewhere inside him a spark of Quixote's idealism had taken root. The dream had infected him, and he didn't mind. One day they were invited to the castle of a duke and duchess. The nobles had read about Don Quixote's earlier adventures and wanted to see him for themselves, not out of respect, but out of amusement. They welcomed him with feigned honor and bowed as he entered. They called him Most Valiant Knight and Champion of Dulcinea. And Don Quixote, with pure innocence, believed every word. But to them it was all a game. They were bored with their riches, and his madness was a new toy. The Duke and Duchess staged elaborate pranks to feed his delusion. They told him that Dulcinea was under a terrible spell, turned into a peasant girl, and that only he could save her. They summoned servants dressed as sorcerers, spirits, and knights. They set traps and mock quests, laughing as he faced them with the earnestness of a true hero. Don Quixote never saw their malice. To him, every challenge was a test of virtue, and in his blindness he became the only noble soul in a castle full of cruel children. Even Sancho was pulled into their games. They rewarded his loyalty by making him the governor of a fake island, a set of rooms in their estate where actors pretended to be his subjects. At first, Sancho was overwhelmed. He could barely read and had never governed anything more than a donkey. But when real people came to him for judgment, something astonishing happened. He listened. He weighed their words, and his answers, simple, humble, honest, astonished everyone. He proved that common sense and kindness were greater than all the learning and titles in the world. When the Duke and Duchess ended the joke, Sancho left not ashamed, but wiser. He had learned that ruling was not about power, but about justice. Meanwhile, Don Quixote continued his quests. Each adventure grew a little sadder, a little more absurd. He fought invisible enemies and spoke to phantoms. He imagined armies in the clouds and sorcerers in the wind. But through his madness, he spoke truths no one else dared to say. He saw the poverty of peasants and the cruelty of nobles, the emptiness of honor and the loneliness of faith. Cervantes lets us see that madness can sometimes be a kind of wisdom. the refusal to accept a world that has forgotten its heart. As they traveled, Sancho and his master grew closer. Their arguments turned into affectionate banter, their mockery into mutual understanding. Sancho began to see that the old man's madness was beautiful, and Don Quixote saw that Sancho's earthly wisdom was divine. Together they became the perfect balance, dream and reality, sky and soil. But no dream can last forever. On the beach at Barcelona, Don Quixote met a new foe, a knight in white armor, his helmet gleaming in the sun. He called himself the Knight of the White Moon and challenged Don Quixote to a duel. The terms were simple. If Don Quixote lost, he must renounce chivalry forever and return home. The two charged across the sand, their lances lowered. In a single crash of wood and steel, Don Quixote fell. The Knight of the White Moon stood over him and declared victory. When he removed his helmet, the truth was revealed. It was Samson Carrasco, a friend from La Mancha disguised in armor, hoping to save him from his delusions. Don Quixote stared up at him, not with anger, but with infinite sadness. The spell was broken. Reality had won. They returned home quietly. Rocinante was older, Sancho was tired. And Don Quixote, once the brightest madman in Spain, was dying. In his bed he lay still and pale, his eyes clearer than they had been in years. He spoke softly, "My friends, I was mad. But my madness was beautiful. I sought a world that should be, not the one that is." He called for his will, forgave his enemies, and thanked Sancho for his love. And then he closed his eyes and died, not as Don Quixote the knight, but as Alonso Quijano, the man who dared to dream. Sancho fell to his knees and wept. He begged him to rise again. "Come, my lord," he said, "there are still giants to fight and islands to find." But the room was silent. The world's greatest dreamer had finally found rest. Cervantes ends his novel with an unusual note. He tells the reader that Don Quixote's death is final, that no other author should ever dare revive him. He wanted his creation to remain pure, untouched by imitators. But he needn't have worried. Don Quixote never died. Not really. Because as long as people believe in something noble, as long as someone is willing to look at windmills and see giants, he rides still. And that is the true magic of Cervantes' masterpiece. It began as a parody of old romances, a comedy about a madman, but it became a reflection of the human soul itself. Don Quixote is every person who has ever believed in a dream that the world calls impossible. He is the painter who keeps painting after 100 rejections. The writer who finishes a novel no one reads. The scientist who searches for truth in a world that prefers comfort. He is madness and beauty entwined, the eternal duel between what is and what could be. Cervantes himself understood that duel. He had fought in war, lost the use of his hand, spent years as a slave in Algiers, and lived most of his life in poverty. And yet, in his final years, he gave the world its first modern novel, a story that still shapes literature 4 centuries later. He showed us that fiction is not an escape from reality. It's a way of understanding it. At its heart, Don Quixote asks a simple question. Is it better to see the world as it is, cold, practical, disenchanted, or to see it as it could be, filled with magic and meaning? Most of us, without thinking, choose the first. But Don Quixote, that thin, tattered knight on his broken horse, chose the second. And in doing so, he reminded us that madness may be the truest form of hope. 400 years later, his story still moves the world. Writers, painters, and philosophers see in him a reflection of the human spirit, tragic and magnificent at once. When Picasso painted his thin silhouette against the sun, he saw not a madman, but a symbol of endless aspiration. When Dostoevsky wrote his tormented souls, he saw a spark of Quixote in them. When modern readers face a world of noise and cynicism, they still find comfort in that quiet voice that says, "Go forth. The world may mock you, but believe anyway." So when you see a windmill spinning on the horizon, remember him. Remember the man who tilted at them not because he was insane, but because he refused to live without wonder. He believed that every act of kindness was a victory, that every dream was worth chasing, even if it ended in defeat, and that to be laughed at for doing good was better than to be praised for doing nothing. So this is how the story ends. A man dies, but his madness becomes immortal. His friend weeps, but his love becomes a legend. And a novel born from mockery becomes a monument to human dignity. If you listen closely, you can still hear Rocinante's hooves on the dusty roads of La Mancha. You can see Sancho's donkey plodding behind. And somewhere in the distance a thin voice calls out, "Forward, Sancho! There are giants ahead," because there will always be giants, and there will always be a Don Quixote to ride against them.